Live your life within the moment. And don't go wait until the morning. You never know when it is over. All that I know is we'll get older. So let us dance this night away.
Hi everyone, and before we begin, please listen to the following important public service announcement from the Honorable Judy Heumann. Judy is the former United States Assistant Secretary of Special Education and Rehabilitative Services in the Clinton administration and the former U.S. State Department Special Advisor for International Disability Rights in the Obama administration. Recently, Judy starred in the Netflix documentary Crip Camp.
Hello, my name is Judy Heumann. I'm here today to encourage you to please take your COVID vaccine. And if you have friends and family that haven't, please encourage them also. COVID is to be taken seriously. In addition to taking the vaccine, please use other protective methods. Wear a mask, use gloves, and sanitize frequently. If you need additional information and you live in Eastern Oregon, you can contact EOCIL. Thank you, and protect yourselves and the community.
Welcome everyone back to Voices in Action, a podcast by Eastern Oregon Center for Independent Living, a global disability resource and advocacy center. And I'm your host, Almader Perez. Over the course of seasons 2 and 3, we're going to be covering a variety of topics that relate to EOCIL's core priorities. And these include, but aren't limited to, HIV and harm reduction services, food and water security, LGBTQI plus advocacy and services, and countless others. And if you're interested in what services we provide, I encourage everyone to check us out online at eocil.org for a full breakdown of what we offer. And during these seasons, we're going to be speaking with individuals with lived experiences, leaders of global and local advocacy organizations, and people responsible for developing and implementing policies that affect our daily lives. And we will learn from each other along the way. And just before we start, I'd like to share some information about our risk and discomfort. So during this episode, we're going to be talking about complex and prolonged trauma that can profoundly affect physical, mental, and behavioral health outcomes across the lifespan. Talking about stress, emotions, and experiences of adverse and traumatic events may be distressing to you. Some items we will be discussing are very personal. They may upset you, and you may find triggering. Listeners' discretion is advised, and if any of these topics or subjects do affect you, please know that you can reach out to EOCIL, where you can talk to a professional counselor in a safe and welcoming environment. Thank you. Okay, I'd like to introduce Carrie Luke. She started her career in the Department of Corrections for 10 years, and after retiring, she returned to school to get her Associates of Arts of Oregon transfer degree and bachelor's in anthropology, sociology, and a master's in social work, all from the Walla Walla University. I just want to thank you real quick, Carrie, for joining me and taking the time out of your day to participate in this and have a conversation about what it is that you do and kind of inform us on the work that you've done in the past and the work that you do right now. If you want to go ahead and introduce yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Amador, for the introduction. Like you mentioned, I have a master's in social work, and so currently I work for EOCIL, East Oregon Center for Independent Living, as a mental and behavioral health specialist. And so right now I specialize in trauma and poverty work, and I work with marginalized groups of people, usually people who have high acuity levels, so basically severe and persistent mental health issues. Much of my work is done with Two-Spirit LGBTQIA plus populations, okay, HIV positive populations, and people who are suffering from substance use disorder.
Okay. And how did you kind of get into that field of work? Did you know exactly, like, getting out of like high school and stuff like that, what you wanted to do, or is it something that just kind of fell into your lap as you grew up?
Yeah, interestingly enough, I didn't really know what I wanted to do directly out of high school, and so I'm kind of a late bloomer in that it just took me a long time to really figure out what my passion was. And like you had mentioned earlier, I started out in law enforcement, with the Department of Corrections. And while I found that work very interesting, it just really wasn't the right fit. So I moved on to working with people in deep poverty for the jobs program.
Okay.
And so I was really passionate about that because when I come from a background of having some trauma. And so I was a 17-year-old mother, and I quickly landed myself in poverty for myself and my daughter. So it was basically the influence of the people that helped me out in that situation that really influenced what I wanted to do. It kind of turned the corner for me and opened my eyes to what other possible venues there were. And that was always in the back of my mind, even throughout those other careers, that I really wanted to get to that place to pay it forward like people had done for me. So it's very much something that has deep personal meaning to me.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned in there like trauma. And for those of you who aren't informed, can you kind of break down what trauma is exactly? Because I know it could be different for every person. There's different forms of trauma. It could be triggered by many different things. And I know first coming into this field of work that I do as a harm reduction specialist, we had to be trained in a trauma informed care manner. So I learned a little bit about what trauma is, doing a couple quick tests online, some certifications, some trainings. But could you kind of break it down to what is trauma and how is it so impactful in people living in poverty or people who may use drugs or people of the LGBTQI community?
Yeah, that's such a great question, Amador. And it's so there's so many facets of what trauma is. So, with a big kind of an umbrella approach over it, trauma really is anything that dysregulates our central nervous system, anything that makes us feel unsafe. So it could range from sexual abuse to physical abuse to emotional abuse. It could be neglect. It could be things that we typically associate with trauma. So there's like two kind of facets that when working with trauma population, there's like the big T traumas that we think of. So everyone thinks of like the acts of war or car accidents or things that put us in our life in jeopardy. So there's big T
Okay.
traumas like that, but there's also little t traumas. So these can be like where we're bullied in school, or we don't feel part of a group, or we just feel very vulnerable. We feel like it's not typically things that involve violence or disaster, but it could be like a breakup or just acts of rejection. And in fact, like when working this with trauma populations, it's really important to not really take focus off of the small t traumas because they can be just as impactful and sometimes, if not more, than the big T traumas.
Okay. So you say by more impactful, is there like a certain way to approach people when you're trying to, get to know them or trying to like offer the services that we have without inducing that trauma to them? Like, is there a certain method that you go into?
Yeah, I mean, like, I think it's also important to just keep in mind that trauma could be one incident, or it can be where it's complex trauma, where it is multiple incidents. So, like when we're interviewing people and we're working with people, they could experience, and many people think trauma is only PTSD, like acts of war or severe acts of violence. And so they don't really realize or make the connection between that these small t traumas actually, in fact, have dysregulated their system even more so than if they would experience one of those bigger traumas. So really what we're doing when we're working with people with traumas is to just be completely aware. And so my first cue when working with people is that I look for the emotional changes in them, that the emotional responses. So this is my first indicator that okay, something here is not right for them. So if I can start feeling, seeing them get jittery or antsy or not paying attention in interviews, this is my first indicator that this person feels unsafe. So yeah, really the work that we do is, like the first rule is we cause no more harm, right? We
Yeah.
want to approach it where we are doing everything very safely. So this goes into the whole approach of having a trauma informed approach as we work with clients and being trauma responsive, even more so.
Was it? 'Cause I know I've struggled with it, especially because I'm out in the streets a lot, talking with community members, and each one of them have their own battles that they're facing, and I know it was made really evident that I need to be careful in the way I approach individuals and being able to like read the room, just because now understanding a little bit more what like trauma informed care is through like the trainings I've taken, and then just like doing a personal analysis of myself and my personal traumas that I've gone through and how it affects me differently compared to someone else who might have had a similar experience but wasn't as traumatic for them. So I've been I've been trying to figure out the best way that I can approach people in poverty, um, in a way that doesn't induce that trauma, because everyone faces a lot of different things. What would you say is like a common thing among people in poverty or people who use drugs that you'd see like a recurrent pattern?
Oh, yeah. So, really, what we can say is that most people seeking services have a trauma background. Like, this is more common than it's not. So, we can just kind of approach the work that we do when working with poverty populations, um, that this is most often the case that they will be experiencing some sort of traumas. And so to keep that in the forefront of our minds when we're working with people, and like really putting a tailored approach on how we work with each individual as well. There's no one size fits all approach to what we do, although there are things that we can kind of be mindful of. So, like obviously we're not going to want to do the like have them experience loud noises or yelling or arguments or being confrontational or being unwelcoming. Like we know that these are kind of standard triggers for people, but also just being really open and welcoming to suggestions. And in fact, most often when I am doing a clinical session with people, I ask for feedback on how can I make you more comfortable in this? What are things in our office environment or things that I do that bother you? I really want your feedback and your input because your healing journey is your own. And so I need to know how to play my part in that too.
Okay. So trauma informed care, I know you touched on that, and you mentioned it before. So kind of what is trauma informed care, and then are the different types of trauma care that are out there?
Yeah, so trauma informed care was kind of the first approach in dealing and working with individuals. And this was the first really verbiage that was put upon this. And like I look at trauma informed care as like a reactionary process, right? Like we'll be aware that there's traumas out there. We'll be aware that people that we're serving are experiencing these things, but we're waiting until they're activated before doing anything. So so trauma responsive care is kind of the next step to this, right?
Okay.
Where we like we're taking a preventative stance. Not only do we have the information that people are coming from a trauma background, but we also we want to take measures in our own approaches with people so that we don't activate and like trigger them while we're providing services. We don't want to re-traumatize people. So this is like the second step to, it's not just trauma informed care that we're worried about. We were wanting to deliver a trauma responsive approach to the work we do with individuals.
Okay. And then how might that vary from like, say, a youth to adults, or maybe even younger, like little children? Like, when does trauma start to affect people?
Yeah, sometimes trauma can be pre-verbal. So when we talk about like the ACEs scores or the adverse childhood experiences, oftentimes we see trauma actually starts from youth. So there's an assessment that it's a very famous assessment. It goes into 10 different scoring systems that talk about traumas that people have experienced before the age of 18. So it will go through like relational, emotional, physical, and neglect categories and score that person in those 10 components of what they've experienced before the age of 18. So we know that this is the lens that people look through as they're kind of navigating through life, is that they've experienced some very difficult hardships early on. So, like current statistics tell us that about 50% of people have at least one ACE, and about 20% of individuals have at least four or more. And four is very significant. It's a very significant amount of for an ACE score. So,
Okay.
because here's why this is so important to know, is because this early childhood experiences, they impact us for the rest of our life, in our physical health, in our emotional well-being, and the way that we can socialize with other people. So this impacts us because oftentimes people don't do well in school if they're experiencing these things. They also are more they gravitate more toward having poor health outcomes. So we know if people score a four or more on ACEs, that they're going to most likely be smokers. They're going to have a propensity to have liver disease and heart disease, lung cancer, and they're going to die much younger than people who aren't experiencing those. So what we can say really is that trauma is completely prevalent in the populations that we serve, both in the poverty population and the people experiencing substance use disorder. So we just know that this early adverse experiences impacts the developing brain and the ability for kids to have to make healthy decisions later on for themselves. So this differs from adult trauma, because the brain is then fully developed at that point, and it's more resilient than, let's say, what a child would experience.
Okay. And how young do you like do these tests or start taking analysis of the trauma that they're facing or what's going on in their life or in their environment? Like how young can you start making all these kind of like decisions?
You can really assess right away. In fact, there are agencies that do assess even children in childhood. They'll start doing these assessments just to see which risk factors that they are exposed to. So it can start very early. I only work with an adult population, so
Okay.
this is really kind of chasing the tiger's tail. Really, this is doing an assessment well into their adulthood about what they experienced earlier on. So, like this is another component of it as well, that it would be very helpful to be preventative in trauma work and address it in childhood.
Okay. And is there a lot of like, so when they do perform these like analysis on them, is there a lot of like fruit that bears from it? Like, are they then placed into therapies or are they placed into counseling or are like the parents informed on how to prevent any future trauma? Or is it more like they just take the analysis and just kind of wish for the best? Or what happens after if they score really high on there?
So this really depends, because like all clients have self-determination. So it's
Yeah.
really their healing journey is really their own. So the people that I'm working with, they're all in therapy with me.
Okay.
Um, and so this is just an assessment that I do with them, just so that they can be aware of what this is, and just to provide some education around, like, this may be the lens that you're looking at the world through because this was what you experienced. It's really helpful information to know what lens you're looking at through life, because this will impact the rest of your life. I know, like other clinicians that work with children, they will have them do this assessment, or they'll take an assessment to see what their risk factors are, and either help the parent put in some more protective factors so that this doesn't become an issue later on. Or, like me, I'm working with adults. I want to give them the assessment so that they have the ability to make informed decisions for themselves at that point.
Okay. And so your primary group is in adults. And then so my question for that would be, do you find it really hard for them to open up about their traumas, or are they a lot more forthcoming with what they're going through? Or is it like a long process for them to like open up and have like a full-on discussion with you about what it is that they got going on in their personal lives? is it a really long process for a lot of people, or is it really common for people to open up to you, or it just depends on their situation?
Yeah, I think that the majority of people are hurting so badly from these that they just want whatever relief that this comes in. And most people are very forthcoming with what those things are. The cautionary thing with working with people with this kind of background, though, is that we never want to do work where the person is doing storytelling, basically, like where they
Okay.
are retelling that whole entire trauma story. That actually solidifies the story in their head, and it deepens that kind of groove into the brain of where that trauma sits. So
Okay.
basically, we're doing this inventory. We're just getting kind of like the iceberg section of it. Like, what are the things that you've experienced so that we can go ahead and then treat this with modalities that, and there's different ways to approach the work with trauma, but we never want to have people do a storytelling of what this is. This, we don't want them to relive this. It's
Okay.
actually, it does more harm than it does good.
You see, and then that's just my lack of education there, because you see everywhere's like, a bunch of movies, and you just hear people say like, oh, you got to face your fears, you got to just confront them head on, stuff like that. So in cases like this, you say it's just better to kind of not have to relive it, go through it and explain it in detail. But like, how would you go about it to open up then?
Yeah, that's a great question. So like when they do the assessment, and I know what kind of traumas and kind of the iceberg situation of what they're wanting to work on.
Yes.
So what we're really focused on is like how this is impacting them in the here and now. So, like what body symptoms are they getting? And so, like we found that like somatic approaches to trauma treatment are actually way more effective than talk therapy modalities. So, like I would go about treating the majority of these traumas with brain spotting or EMDR. I'm not an EMDR clinician. I am a brain spotting clinician, and this is how I treat the majority of these traumas. So I do like somatic approaches. Something like yoga can be very effective too. So we're focusing on what's happening to the body and to the emotions in the here and now. So we're not so much focused on what this is that happened way back in the past. We're focusing on what is it, how is it impacting you now? So let's say I got in a car accident, and this is the trauma that I want to focus on. I'm not going to go back through the entire storytelling of what happened in that accident. What I'm going to do is focus on what are the difficulties it's causing me right now. So am I having anxiety about getting into the car? Am I avoiding getting in the car completely? So we're treating what the here and now symptoms are.
Okay, so that seems like really similar to kind of like the example you just provided was something that I've faced with for years. Is I had a car accident when I was a lot younger. It was a family trip heading to Disneyland, and we got in a car accident while I was sleeping, and that just made it so where I can no longer sleep at night because it's like a trigger for me that danger's gonna happen, that something bad's gonna happen, and I've struggled with insomnia for years now. I've tried almost everything. I've tried, light therapy, listening to music, ambient noises, red noises, white noises, anything and everything. I've tried like edibles that are supposed to help you sleep. I've tried melatonin, everything back and forth. And that's something that I'm still working on, is being able to rest my mind at night and being able to sleep, knowing that I'm going to be safe, and wake up in the morning. So that's something that I deal with. And I've never heard, cause I've gone to like my doctor's visit and spoke about it. I can kind of see now how that was just ingraining that image of going to sleep is bad by me having to retell it to them and retell it to them and tell them what I was feeling on that day, what it was like being woken up by a car. And see, I've never heard of that. And then I know you mentioned in there brain spotting. What is that exactly?
Yeah, that's the most effective modality for treating trauma. And so it's really interesting in the fact that I basically have a wand that I use. And so I'll hold this wand up because what we learned is that where we look impacts how we feel. So as you kind of look around the room, you can designate points in that where and this is attached to any memory. It could be traumatic or it could be a positive memory. Your eyes will gravitate toward that portion, that spot, where that memory is trapped, and it's directly associated with where that thought or memory is kind of stored in your brain. So what happens then is that I have you focus on that spot while you're processing that memory, while you're not telling the story. You're basically sitting quietly processing what is happening, because what happens when you experience something traumatic, and like you can even think about this, like if you've ever like almost gotten in an accident on your bicycle or something as a kid, and everything kind of slows down and time seems to be moving really slowly until the accident happens. Your brain is like basically just taking snippets of information as the thing is happening. It's not getting the whole entire story. Our brains love to have the whole entire story, and if it doesn't, it's going to continue to replay that story and try to fill in the missing pieces. So what this modality does then is have you focus where that memory is stored and process. Sometimes it can take 5 minutes, sometimes it can take 45 minutes. And then, so what we're doing is we're basically what I call squeezing the lemon. We're getting all of that emotion and those body responses out of that trapped stored memory. And it's like completing the memory for you, so then your brain can sort it away in the appropriate spots. And it feels, I've had clients describe it as, it feels very distant from me now. It feels like I know that it happened to me, but it feels like it's almost someone else's story. So it just creates distance and healing in that.
Oh, wow. And is that the same process you would do for like a child or an adult, or is that primarily a method that you use for more mature demographic?
Yeah, that's the great thing about it, is that you can use it for all ages. Anybody who can focus their attention long enough on just one spot can participate in this modality. Like there's other modalities that they've used in the past, like talk therapy modalities, like trauma focused CBT or dialectical behavioral therapy. Those are effective, but they're not as effective as the modalities that use like somatic, the ones that use your body, that focus on the impacts of your body too. Because here's the thing, we can't separate our minds from our body. So they're one and the same. So as our brains experience trauma, our bodies do too. And so a lot of times we'll see body responses to the trauma prior to the person even realizing that they're kind of being triggered by this.
Okay. And then you mentioned also, like when you were talking about brain spotting, you mentioned that even yoga could possibly be a method.
Yeah,
How
absolutely.
how does that one kind of, because that one kind of piqued my interest, because when I think of yoga, I think of just like exercise. I wouldn't consider it as a way to kind of like heal or help manage trauma. So how does that play a factor in trauma, or helping someone move through a difficult time in their life?
There's two ways that this works. And this is probably why it's been a practice that's been in place for thousands of years, is that first of all, it kind of brings the mind to the present. And so it makes you you're basically practicing as a form of meditation and mindfulness at that point.
Okay.
So you can't focus on the past or the future. So you can't have anxiety or depression thoughts while you are focused directly on what you're doing. So that's one way that it works. The other one that's more interesting, and this is more kind of a new thought, and there, of course, like more research needs to be done in this, but our traumas get stored in our fascial tissue, which is like the lining over our muscles. So this is why some people believe that acupuncture works as well, because it taps into that fascial tissue. But this yoga, stretches these fascial lines where trauma is stored as well. So that it can be effective in both ways.
Okay. Yeah, so it just stuck out to me because yoga to me, I think of it like a form of exercise. And then once you mentioned meditation, I was like, okay, I could see it being that way, especially when it's not kind of like speaking the story again, just kind of sitting on the idea. I kind of want to move on to another question that I have here written down, and it kind of deals with, where do you see most of the trauma coming from? Is it people in poverty? Is it single mothers, or is it like where's a majority of people suffering with trauma coming from, and kind of like why is it?
Yeah, the majority are going to be marginalized populations. They're going to be persons of color. It's going to be Two-Spirit LGBTQIA plus population. It's going to be people in poverty. And of course, then this runs back into kind of the chicken or the egg argument. There's arguments that substance use disorder causes trauma, but
Mhm.
there's also evidence that suggests that it's the opposite way as well. So there's almost like this cycle of, if you've experienced trauma, then you have a propensity to use substances. But you also, if you use substances, then you tend to put yourself in really harmful situations that set you up to have trauma as well. So this is why each person's story about their own life is really important to kind of gain and know what you're working with each individual, and to come up with an individualized plan for each person, because no two people are going to be alike, and no two people experiencing trauma are going to experience it the same way.
Yeah. And then does it because it sounds like kind of like it fall into like a cycle, so to say, like that using people who use induces trauma, but then that trauma can also cause people to use. So how difficult is it for someone who is using to get into a better state of mind to where they're not using and they're not being re-triggered by past traumas? Because it does sound like a cycle to the point where, they use because of trauma and the trauma makes them want to use.
Yeah, it's really important to treat both mental health and so the traumas and substance use disorder, if that's applicable, at the same time. So, like what we do is we're treating everything all together in conjunction with each other. They're one and the same. The treatment go hand in hand. In the past, it's been where, like if the person was experiencing substance use disorder, which is a high amount of this population that has experienced trauma. In the past, we've treated either the substance use disorder first and then the trauma later, or we treat the trauma first and then try to attack the substance use disorder. Well, that's not as effective. It's most likely the plan will most likely fail if you don't treat the two in conjunction with each other. So this is kind of the approach to it, is that we sit down, we kind of do an assessment, we figure out what these things are. These comorbidities is what it's called, when they have both substance use disorder and they have mental health conditions as well. So we really want to do a thorough assessment into what this is and what we're treating, and then like get buy-in from the client as well into what are you wanting to work on, what are you willing to work on, and we'll do that first.
Okay. And do you find it then a lot of the time that the marginalized groups face the most trauma? Is it because there's not enough help for them, or is it like a cultural aspect? Because I say cultural aspect because being Hispanic, being Mexican, with my parents both being Mexican, I was raised with the ideas that you don't talk about your emotions, you don't go talk to a counselor, you just deal with it, move on, push forward. Why is it that a lot of the people who do face trauma are part of these marginalized communities? Is it because of like cultural aspects, or is it not enough care, in your opinion, that's provided to them? The access to care isn't really that prevalent for them, or how are you seeing trauma being addressed for the people who are in the marginalized communities?
Yeah, it's all of those, Amador. Honestly, it is kind of a distrust in the system.
Hmm.
It is where like certain population groups don't really that isn't something that they believe in. Therapy is not kind of the first go to. I think that there is an access issue. There is also a lack of providers that look like the clients that we're wanting to serve. And so this I think creates more access issues, because traditionally people want to go to a provider that looks like them. So this is creates a big barrier to service, because unless you are informed and know how to reach the population groups that are the most marginalized, this creates a disservice to this population group.
Being a devil's advocate here in this situation, what would you then advise? So knowing that I'm come from a Hispanic background, like if I if someone were to bring me to you and I was like, oh no, I don't want to talk about it, I'm just gonna deal with it in my own way. What would that potentially end up causing for me if I'm holding in a trauma, not wanting to speak about it just because the way I grew up, I was like, no, you don't talk to a therapist, you don't go to counseling, you just deal with it, push it aside and move on. How can that affect someone in the long run? Or even does it have like short-term consequences to kind of keeping it bottled in, as you know, that term is, just bottle it up?
It has short-term consequences and it has long-term consequences. I mean, the short term is obviously that, Amador, if we're using you for an example, that you will be struggling with this trauma by yourself, kind of left to your own means to treat that trauma by yourself. So the other part is that it has long-term impacts because we know that poverty, substance use disorder, and mental health all are cyclical. And so that if you are then pass this down to future generations that you are exposed to, whether your own family, your own children, yeah, so like that's the way that it would impact you long term, is that so basically we hand things down. These traumas get handed down to our children. So let's say my parents experience a traumatic event, and if that is undealt with, they will pass these hereditary conditions. Like we can see that in like physical health things. So like this is where like the stem of diabetes or cancer or heart conditions get passed down. So these traumas get passed down in the form of physical illness, but they also get passed down in like mental health diagnoses as well. So if I have parents that have anxiety disorders, chances are I will also have an anxiety disorder. So it's really crucial to treat these. What we can see, like we can see a genetic link between these things too, is that people with traumas will have a shortening on their DNA strands, the telomeres that they have, they're the caps of our DNA strands, will actually be frayed. So this is how it impacts us in later generations, because we're passing down those DNA strands to our offspring. So this is how it has long-term and lasting impact on future generations. So this is how we get to the intergenerational trauma.
Oh wow. See, I didn't know that part, especially because, and I'll play devil's advocate again. If my parents were, dealing with trauma and they ended up passing it down to me, and I was just like, oh, it's just a mentality thing. I can either accept it and, perceive myself to have severe anxiety, or I can just say, oh, whatever, I don't have anxiety and move on. That not like, is it partially like mentality wise? Like you can self-diagnose yourself to have anxiety, or, self-diagnose yourself to have like some mental disorder, or is that actually something that can be passed down from generation to generation?
Yeah, typically it's passed down from generation to generation. And interesting enough, we will seek out partners
Hmm.
or mates that have similar mental health diagnoses.
Yeah.
So if I have anxiety, most likely I will go into a room of people and be attracted to other people with anxiety.
Oh.
And so this kind of creates the pull of now we have two parents that both have anxiety disorders making another child with an anxiety disorder. And here's the interesting thing about this is that if I am a pregnant woman, if anything traumatic happens to me during pregnancy, not only is it that I'm experiencing that trauma, I'm passing this trauma into my fetus, and the fetus has developed eggs, if it's a female baby, that will also be linked to that trauma, all in, so basically 3 generations being impacted at that point.
Yeah, because and I bring that up because just like scrolling through my social medias and stuff like that, I'll be seeing a lot of videos where people who have parents that are depressed or stuff like that, and then pass it to like clinical depression down, and and they say like, oh, depression is just a state of mind. You can either choose to be depressed or you can get over it, or you can, go do something that makes you happy, fun, that doesn't put you in that depressive state of mind. So that's why I bring it up, because that's what I see constantly when I'm scrolling through social media, and where I hear like friends are talking about. It's like, oh, how can you possibly be depressed? Like that's not a thing. That's just you being lazy, not wanting to actually like get out and just live your life or be happy. You're choosing to be in that state of mind. how bad does that act, like that way of thinking affect, the whole idea of going into counseling to get trauma informed? Like how does that have a bad effect on this
I
topic?
think it's really invalidating to a person, like only you as the client know what your experience is.
Yeah.
So I think it's invalidating to say, hey, it's only a state of mind, when in fact, like if this is something that's persistent, this could actually be a chemical imbalance and need to be treated with pharmaceuticals. Sometimes, like it can be treated with like CBT, let's say. So where it focuses on kind of reframing your thoughts. So, like we know what the brain thinks is what our emotions end up being, and our emotions impact our actions. So, like if I wake up and I'm feeling depressed and I keep on saying to myself, oh, Carrie, you are super depressed, I am going to, like my brain is going to be like, yes, I'm going to reinforce this, that you do in fact feel depressed now. So, like if I allow my brain to be in that mindset, my actions are going to be, like where I will be kind of pulled to be laying in bed then. So, like it's yes to both of them. Like it
Okay.
it can be a state of mind, but it also can be persistent illness too. And so I think it's really invalidating to clients if we only look at one of those options.
Okay. Yeah, 'cause I bring that up in that sense that that's what I've been seeing on social media. And so how would you differentiate that between someone who is actually having that chemical imbalance, is actually suffering from a clinical depression, to someone who's just reinforcing that into their own mind, saying, "Oh, I think I'm depressed," and then they get into that own slump. How do you determine who's actually clinically depressed, has this chemical imbalance, and to who's someone who's just making themselves believe it's true?
Yeah, usually this goes kind of into length of how, like, what was the onset of this condition? Is this been something that this person's been experiencing for a very long time? How persistent is it? Is this like a daily thing that they're battling with? Usually it would not be a persistent illness until it's been a daily occurrence for about 6 months or so.
Okay.
So, like then we kind of look into like this could indeed be a chemical imbalance, or it could be a situational depression, right? Like I could have had a family member pass away and this draws me into like being really depressed. Or it could be just, like my mindset needs, kind of some tweaking and some revamping. I need a reframing. But, like the client knows themselves best. So, like
Yeah.
this kind of gets back into like the trauma responsive care is like, I'm not the expert of this person sitting in front of me. The person sitting in front of me is the expert of themselves, and I'm just here to give, like present some resources, and then, like have them decide what it is that fits into how they want to heal.
Okay. And so what are some of the resources that you mentioned that you'd give them?
For depression in itself, or just like mental health or
Uh,
substance use.
Kind of like substance use as a whole. So if someone were to come in and talk to you about like trauma or something like that that they're dealing with, what resources, where do you send them to? What do you offer them? It could be depression, or does PTSD fall into that as well as a form of trauma? Trauma, right?
Absolutely. So not all traumas are PTSD, or like
Okay.
uh, you can have traumas in your life without it getting the diagnosis of PTSD. So if someone was in fact diagnosed with PTSD, what I would want to do at that point is, of course, see if they're willing to treat what those past traumas are by like a brain spotting modality. We would have weekly sessions to do talk therapy sessions as well. So it's like this complex puzzle, and you're just looking at different areas and you're treating the person in their entirety. Like we're looking at, are these emotional things that are happening? Are they physical things that have contributed to this? Are they biological things that have contributed? So then we're vetting out to see which factors apply to this person and this issue. And then, so like, let's say that there are biological factors that are contributing. Well, then, like I'm going to ask, do you have a primary care physician that you're seeing? Are you treating any biological factors that are there? If it is like emotional type things, so then we're working on that. If it is outside of my scope of practice, or if I need pharmaceuticals, then a referral is made for the person to be treated in that manner. So we're just looking at, is it social factors? Are there things that we can improve in their social settings that make this less problematic for them? So it's a complicated puzzle for each person.
Okay. So yeah, because that sounds really, there's a lot of variables that go into it then. Because so there's a lot of it that's just a mental understanding what they're going through mentally, but can that be disguised through like substance use? Like someone who's using, how does that get kind of lost through there? If they're someone who's using, how does that hide it?
Yeah, they can look really similar. So, like on its face, mental health conditions can look like substance use disorder, and substance use disorder can look like mental health conditions. So, let's say, like a person comes in with anxiety. Is it true anxiety where it's just a mental health component? Is it trauma related? Is it from PTSD? Is it the anxiety condition of post-traumatic stress disorder? Or, like, is it perhaps that the person is withdrawing off of opiates and they're experiencing anxiety from that? Or, like another example is, like, is a person comes in with schizophrenia, or what I think is schizophrenia, it could in fact be methamphetamine use. So they look very similar to each other oftentimes. So this is again in like the vetting process and building trust with the person that you're working with. And sometimes you're only getting a small portion of the story to begin with. And as they trust you, then more of this story comes out. And then you have a bigger picture of like, then how do we treat this?
Okay. And then so for the people who do go through that process of like you figure out what it is that best suits them, kind of what's like the success rate? How many people do you see that, do overcome this trauma and are able to maybe not exactly like just move on entirely, but are able to manage it a lot better and not have to have it linger on their mind? How effective is this work that you do?
It is very slow going. So this is the other portion about this work, is that you just have to have reasonable expectations about what it is that a person can accomplish. I think that we've had a lot of success in using brain spotting for a modality to treat PTSD. I've also seen some great advances in substance use disorders using brain spotting as well. So there are success stories, but like in treating trauma, we're basically asking the person to undo the lens that they've been looking at through life, their entire lifestyle, usually like their entire life.
Yeah.
So this is a slow growing process until that their brain kind of relearns that, hey, maybe this world isn't as scary or dark or like as I've always perceived it to be, because this was my lived experience. So this is a process of unlearning, and substance use disorder as well. So because they go hand in hand, we're asking the person to change every facet of their life. So the way that they've coped before, they're building new resiliency and new coping mechanisms. This is not a quick process by any means.
Yeah, for sure. And and having talked with you right now and like you explaining everything, there's a lot that goes into it, from like the environment they grew up in and how they perceive themselves, and if they self-diagnose themselves with something that they might not have, or it might be hereditary that they picked up from the parents and they don't even know that it's there, affecting them in their daily lives. And I know earlier on in this conversation, you mentioned that it's a lot more prevalent in people than we really know. A lot more people have traumas that that they're not aware of yet. What's something that we can do not only here at our organization, but to we can do to bring awareness for this, to inform people about trauma, about going in and getting the help that they need, or just going in and talk, even if you're not like fully on board with it, at least making that step, that initial effort to at least check it out, see what it is, dip your toes in the water before you go dive in for head first.
Yeah, I think the first component of it is just that that we make it a regular part of everyday conversation, just like we would talk about our physical health.
Yeah.
So we talk about our mental health as it is just a daily part of what we speak about. So we're kind of releasing the stigma from what this used to be, of this this doesn't make you weak. In fact, like this is no different than if you're like, let's say, suffering from depression. This is no different than you treating any kind of biological thing that you have going on.
Yeah.
So it'd be no different than going to see the doctor for a bad cough. So, like we just need to bring awareness, like first and foremost, just bringing it into everyday conversation. I think the other part is just like walking our walk, right? Or walking our talk. If we, like if I'm suffering from something like that, just being open and honest about what this is that I'm going through as well. So just kind of bringing that into light and being at the forefront of this conversation. I think the other thing too is that, like we really need to focus on visibility in areas, like that marginalized populations are in. Really targeting that because they've been overlooked for very long.
Yeah, for sure. And I know, especially here, like in Ontario area, the huge population is Hispanic. And, as when I was saying earlier about like the cultural beliefs and stuff like that, where we don't talk about our emotions. I know for the line of work that I do with, being open about sexual education, about testing yourselves for HIV, AIDS, STIs, STDs, that's something we do not talk about at all with our parents and family. And so the more I've been getting to do this work, the more comfortable it is for me to talk about it. So I'm able to talk to them about it. But then I've started to pick up on that okay, maybe they're not as open to it at the beginning, but the more and more I talk to them, the more and more they're opening up. But I'm still finding this whole talking about your emotions, talking about your past traumas, talking about what you've gone through in your life is so hard for them to open up. And that's something that I'm trying to push a lot more when I do my outreach. I'll be going out talking to a lot of the homeless population. I go out to them. I don't ever start out by, telling them like, hey, I'm doing this kind of work, blah, blah, blah. Do you need my services? I understand, know that they're a human being. I get to know them before I ever
Yes.
offer any of my services. I introduce myself, say hi, I get to know their names. And if I don't talk about my services that day, then I'm like, okay, awesome, move on. I'll see him again tomorrow. And then maybe if the topic comes up, I'll offer him my services. If not, well, I know his name. I'll ask how he's doing, and then I'll go on. And so I've fortunately gotten lucky enough to meet some people that I've directed them to like peer counselors over at some of our community partners. And I do have some more people coming into the office here in Ontario that are asking for more of our LGBTQ services, not only for like medical appointments, finding doctors that are supportive and advocates of that community, but also for like counseling services and stuff like that. And knowing that you do a lot of work with them and this is something you do, that's where I'm gonna be sending them to. So when I do send someone to you, what's the process? So what can people expect if they come into EOCIL and would like to speak with you? What's that process like? Is it long? Do we have to fill out a form? Is there a bunch of questions, surveys, or what do they need to do to sit down with you? And
Yeah, just basically reach out to me and let me know that there's a need. There's no lengthy process to get in for substance use disorder services. The Burn 110 grant. They're also the other portion of my position is to work with the Cultivate Housing Group, and that there is a vetting process, and there's only a certain number of people who can be accepted to that program. But I would say in general, just kind of reaching out to me and letting me know that there's a need there and that that person is wanting contact. So my process is very similar to yours, Amador, that my first couple sessions are just basically just getting to know who the person is. It slow goes it into these types of conversations because let's be honest, if someone has had a lifetime of the mindset that this isn't a safe share, this isn't a safe place to share, and I really shouldn't be doing this. It's not a trauma responsive approach for me to say like, hey, in the first session, tell me every single one of your details that you've been through. That's not effective. It's too much too fast.
yeah,
So it's just basically kind of a rapport building and seeing what they're comfortable and willing and wanting to share. Like oftentimes it's just kind of a slow movement into it. But like I think that there's other times where people are very open about they've just been hurting so long that they want immediate relief too.
yeah, yeah. I know that recalls kind of like one of my first experience here when I first started going out. I met this gentleman, and from like all the stories that I heard and the conversations that I kind of was a part of, I could tell that he just wanted words of affirmation, that's what really made him beam with joy. Because the stories he told was always being neglected, always being told he can't do anything, always these negative words, these negative ideas brought to him. And I remember he was so happy one day that he finally went in, he got his ID, he got his check, and he didn't spend it on things that he didn't need. He put it in the savings account. And all I said was like, "Oh, I'm so happy for you. I'm glad you're making these steps for yourself." And he just looked at me and was so happy that I just acknowledged him and was happy for him. That from there he was like, no one's ever treated me like this. No one ever says they're happy for me. No one ever says good job or you're doing good. And I was the first person, and I hardly knew him. I've only met him a handful of times, but I took the time to understand, what it is that he needs and what makes him happy. And I just said that I was happy for him and I'm glad he's doing all these things. And from there, he was able to asked me what I do for work, and that's when I was able to tell him like I do X, Y, and Z. A syringe exchange, STD testing, HIV. And he's like, oh well, if you do needle exchange, I know a lot of people that do use. I'll go ahead and tell them about you. I'll start spreading your word. I'm thankful for you being out here, and through there, I'm not only you know being there for him, but I'm able to interact with a lot more people through him just because of that one good experience I had. Just getting to know him and, treating him like a human being rather than anyone else.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's so important to consider all of your work with people as in being person-centered. Like we consider the individual first, and then whatever this is that they're seeking services for second. Like we want to always have the individual themselves as being front and center in this process. And this is part of becoming a trauma responsive
Yeah.
agency, is that we treat the person as a person themselves first, and then whatever those resources are that they're needing, that's secondary. It's the relationship building that's primary. And this is, in fact, the biggest sense of healing or like therapeutic services that we can really do, is just building a real connection with people.
Yeah. And you kind of mentioned that there is being people centered, kind of, that goes with like people first language. Could you kind of dive into more of like what that is and kind of explain to people who don't know what people first language or being people centered is? Because I didn't understand it, because when I first started, I used words like, oh, that disabled person instead of a person with a disability. So I didn't use people first language. And it took me a little bit to understand like the significance that has for someone who is a person with a disability rather than a disabled person. So can you kind of explain to like the effects of what that does to someone and kind of like the trauma that can induce in itself, the language that we choose to use?
Yeah, I mean, like that can be completely traumatic to someone, like being diagnosed or being having their diagnosis put before who they are. Like I can imagine what that would be like as like on the opposite end of that, where like if I'm explained as a person that has depression, instead of like this is Carrie and she happens to suffer from depression. It's a much different language when you're putting the person in front of whatever this is that they're struggling with. But it can be traumatic to the person themselves when they're feeling like you're treating the condition I have first and not me as the person sitting in front of you.
Yeah. So yeah, I just really wanted to touch on that real quick because you had just mentioned it and it kind of like struck into my mind. But I also don't want to take up too much of your time because I know you're busy. Is there any kind of like final thoughts or a last message you'd like the people to know, kind of, where they can find you, or is there something like really important that you want them to take away from this that relates to either trauma or people in poverty, people who use drugs, people in marginalized communities, BIPOC, anything really? The floor is yours.
Okay, so I have some final thoughts. There's about five of them. So well, okay, so there's multiple, but there's five facets of it. So basically, like I said earlier, do no harm to the person. So what we're looking at is we're providing services to this person when we want to create no more harm to them. We do not want to re-traumatize them. So when you're in doubt, when anyone is in doubt, if they don't know if this is what the services they're going to provide, ask a mental health clinician or refer them to the provider. So we only practice within our own lanes, every single one of us. So we realize trauma for what it is. And then I want to, like really touch on like having trauma awareness, and like we've been talking about the whole entire time, validating the person's experience, because this is their experience, this is their the lens that they view life through, and that shouldn't be negated. So, like just being a safe and trustworthy person is the other portion of it. So realize that the person will go about this process at their own pace. And then like we were mentioning earlier, give them control and choice and collaboration. So they're working with you. You're not coming up with all the ideas. We're just working as a team, but they are in full control of this vehicle. So they're the driver of this vehicle. I think it's important to always look at people through, like you were saying, Amador,
Yeah.
a strength-based lens, where like we're not focusing on what this person doesn't have, we're focusing on the strengths that they do possess and building upon those. This is the easiest path in. And then like looking at this from a cultural perspective and a gender perspective, and so really focusing on what their social identity is as well, and recognizing that. And I think that goes back into just having awareness of who this is you're working in, and being respectful of how they want to be addressed, how they want to be referred to, and what they want to work on. I think that it's important to give compassionate care to people, and to truly just care about who they are as a person. And just like I think the last closing thought is just having reasonable expectations about how much progress that we can make with someone. We're letting them set the pace. They're the pace car.
Okay. Well, awesome.
That's really all that I have.
All righty. Well, thank you so much again. I know I learned so much right now, especially between like big T trauma, little T trauma, the effects that it has, the different modalities that help people work through it. So I really want to thank you for taking the time, like I said, out of your day. I know you're busy, but I really appreciate it. And anyone listening, if you have any questions for myself or Carrie, feel free to email us or visit us online, email, give us a phone call. We do serve 13 counties in Eastern Oregon. And we have 5 office locations, one in Burns, Dalles, Pendleton, LeGrand, and Ontario. So if you're around that area, drop in at our offices. We're more than happy to talk with you, sit down, and direct you to the proper personnel. But yeah, other than that, this has been Voices in Action, a podcast brought to you by EOCIL.
Live your life within the moment. And don't go wait until the morning. You never know when it is over. All that I know is we'll get older. So let us dance this night away.